Hello, I'm Aleksandra Vučković. I work as a research assistant at the University of Belgrade Faculty of Philosophy, and today I will be talking about language barriers and linguistic injustice in science. This talk is based on a paper I have written with my friend and colleague, Dr. Vlasta Sikimić from University of Tübingen, and it has just been published in Social Epistemology. I will put the link in the video description in case you find this presentation interesting and wish to read the entire thing. Now, when we talk about language barriers, the first thing that comes to mind are different misunderstandings that occur when we travel to a foreign country. But it can also happen in a professional and scientific context, and it can strongly influence how we are perceived and whether we are being taken seriously. This is something that happened both to me and Vlasta, as we are native Serbian speakers. Serbian is a Slavic language, and Slavic languages, unlike English, German, or French, do not have the articles. That means that whenever we learn a new language, we also learn new structures, which makes it easier for us to make some mistakes. But today I'm going to be talking about more extreme situations because those happen a lot as well. And a good example of communication gone totally wrong was a real-life experience of a German scientist, Harald Zurhausen, and his research team. They have famously discovered that the vast majority of cervical cancer cases were being caused by certain types of HPV virus. While the scientific community at the time already knew that oncoviruses existed, they were thought to be pretty rare. So you can guess this discovery was something rather important, new, and unexpected. Of course, they were pretty excited about it and couldn't wait to share it with their peers. But there was one little problem. Their knowledge of English was very limited at best, so when it came to verbal presentation at the conference, they couldn't find proper words, which resulted in them being totally dismissed, all because they hit a language barrier. They said they couldn't remember proper words, they couldn't understand the questions that were being asked, and the audience did not like this. Everyone became so agitated to a point they became even hostile towards the presenters. And by the time the presentation was finished, nobody even cared about the discovery they just presented. The damage had already been done, and it took them quite a while before they re-established the trust of the scientific community, all because of their lack of proficiency in English. Now, this is not to say there aren't certain benefits in having English as lingua franca, that is, the universal language of science. It creates opportunities for worldwide scientific collaborations as well as wider peer reviews. But it also gets imposed on impoverished societies, as their languages are often not as dominant as English. It may also lead to language elitism, which happened to Zurhausen's team, because there is always certain prejudice towards those who are not very fluent in English. And finally, it may lead to epistemic injustice, which also happened to Zurhausen's team and which is the main topic of this research. The topic of language barriers has been previously discussed in both epistemology and philosophy of science. American philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine famously introduced the thesis of indeterminacy of translation. It's a thought experiment in which an anthropologist has to translate a completely new language to English without knowing a single word of that language. To do so, she has to observe the context in which certain words and phrases are being uttered, and based on that context, try to guess the meaning behind the words and sentences. So, for instance, if there is a rabbit running around and she hears the speakers of that language shout "gavagai," her first instinct would be to translate the word "gavagai" as English word rabbit. But she may be wrong, and gavagai might in fact mean running rabbit, or even something more obscure such as the notion of rabbithood. That is because we cannot be sure whether this new language operates within the same set of notions as English. In fact, it may rely entirely on the concepts that are different from English and quite even exotic from our point of view. However, if there is something to be taken from this thought experiment, it's how the empirical content can compensate for the imperfect understanding of verbal communication. And unfortunately, this empirical content is often missing at the spoken presentations because we do not have the insight into the raw data that led the researchers to certain conclusion. We only have their word for it, and if we cannot understand the words they are saying, the problems are bound to arise. If we were to compare the real-life situation of Zuthausen's team with this thought experiment, it would be similar to having an anthropologist wear a blindfold while trying to guess the meaning behind the words. So, the question arises: how do we compensate for the imperfect use of English, specifically in the absence of the objective empirical content? More importantly, what if the meaningful and unique scientific concepts get lost in the process of translation because we so desperately try to fit them into the existing structures of the English language? That's why we argue that untranslatability in itself is neither a virtue nor a vice in scientific research. It is simply a fact that needs to be taken into account in order to enrich the findings. Language barriers may also lead to epistemic injustice. There are several types of epistemic injustice, one of them being testimonial injustice, as introduced by Miranda Fricker. Testimonial injustice occurs when someone's testimony is being discriminated and dismissed because they belong to a marginal group. It can happen to women in science, researchers of colors, those with foreign names, and so on. It can also happen to those researchers who are not proficient in English, and when that happens, we call it linguistic testimonial injustice. It's what happened with Zuthausen's team. Yet another type of epistemic injustice, also introduced by Miranda Fricker, is hermeneutical injustice. Hermeneutical injustice occurs when someone's discovery is so new and unique that they can't find the proper words to describe it because such a vocabulary has yet to be invented. Since Zuthausen's discovery was rather new and unexpected, and the scientific community didn't know that much about oncoviruses at the time, this leads us to a conclusion that his team has faced both the testimonial and hermeneutical injustice on the top of that. And the problem with testimonial and hermeneutical epistemic injustice is that it does not only harm the individual researchers or research teams, but the whole scientific community. The whole body of science suffers the damage as well, since the data and knowledge of the marginalized agents get lost. The more the marginalized agents face the epistemic injustice, the more of epistemic diversity is lost. So, in order to preserve the epistemic diversity, we need linguistic diversity as well. A good example of linguistic tolerance can be found in the anthropological notion of cultural translation. It basically states that culture is inseparable from the language because it strongly influences how we perceive the world around us and how we talk of those perceptions. Another good example of linguistic diversity can be found in the interdisciplinary research that is particularly needed in times of crisis, such as was the recent one with COVID pandemic. If all those scientists from different scientific background can reach mutual understanding despite the differences in the scientific jargon, then we argue the same can apply to those scientists from different linguistic backgrounds. And there's yet another, a bit more political reason why we argue for the linguistic diversity. We know that the ancient Greece was the center of European culture at the time, and that's when the ancient Greek was also lingua franca. With the rise of Roman Empire, Latin overtook its place. So it is no surprise that English is the lingua franca of today, because Great Britain used to have so many colonies around the world where the language was imposed on different ethnicities and cultures. Elizabeth Anderson argues for integration and equality as central virtues in the scientific research. We agree with her thesis and would like to strengthen it even further through inclusion and the notion of equity. Inclusion is a process during which the whole community is adapting itself in a way that it's becoming more approachable and more welcoming to those who are marginalized. It is a process opposed to assimilation, during which the marginalized agents are being taught how to fit into the existing structures, even when those structures are not particularly open towards them. While the idea of inclusion originates from the educational context, we argue that it can be applied to scientific community as well and could help us reach what is called the tempered equality. Tempered equality is a thesis introduced by Helen Longino, and it basically states that a scientist should be respected solely to her achievements and independently of any other aspect of her life. This type of openness is what is the key step in getting from equality de jure to equality de facto. Which brings us to the topic of equity, which refers to the incorporation of the socioeconomic background of the researchers. There are certain steps that need to be taken in order to achieve the equity. First, the privileges of native speakers should be recognized. Second, we should extend the principle of equity to other types of injustice, not just the linguistic one, because they are often intertwined. And finally, we should accept linguistic diversity as an important asset in achieving social equality. This is where the concept of mitigation comes to play. Mitigating agents are those individuals, groups, or even whole research facilities that can serve as a communication bridge between the native and the non-native speakers of English. For someone to become a mitigating agent, they should be proficient in English and willing to promote and translate the ideas and notions that originate from different cultures, particularly those ideas and notions that are especially hard to translate. There are some steps in the process of mitigation that can be taken as of today. Firstly, the general criterion for the knowledge of lingua franca should be weaker. Native speakers should adapt their presentations, speak more slowly, and use a widely known vocabulary. Journals could also become more available to the non-native speakers, for instance, through offering free proofreading services. At the conferences, a translation of the live speech should also be introduced more often. Online translation services, such as, for instance, Grammarly, should become available at the cost of research facilities as opposed to being paid for almost exclusively by the non-native individuals. More resources should also be put into the development of different applications for the automated translation that exist even today. None of this is science fiction. Those services and applications are already in use. They just need to get slightly more improved and more available to everyone worldwide. It should be kept in mind that though the translation is a very important asset in achieving mitigation, it's only the first and currently the most achievable step. But we should not stop there. More attention should be given to national journals, and references should not be cut even if they are in the foreign language. We should also promote bilingualism in publications, with the same paper being published both in lingua franca and in the author's native language. When it comes to science funding, it should be distributed cross-culturally and cross-nationally so that everyone can have a fair chance in achieving academic success. Therefore, successful mitigation should: first, follow the principle of equity and aim to achieve inclusion in science. Secondly, it should be initiated by those who are privileged and aimed towards those who are marginalized. Thirdly, it should be receptive of the ideas and notions from different cultures, even when those ideas and the notions sound strange when they are translated to English. And finally, it should lead communication based on openness, impartiality, and charitable approach. However, there is still a risk of the mitigating agents and native speakers becoming overwhelmed despite the adequate compensations for their efforts. That is why it is important that the mitigation is properly balanced. In other words, the costs of mitigation should not outweigh the benefits derived from it. Finally, it should not only benefit those who are marginalized, but the whole scientific community as well. The whole body of knowledge will get larger and more epistemically diverse if we include the knowledge and the ideas of the marginalized agents. This was the short presentation of the paper that Vlasta and I have written. I will put the link in the video description in case you wish to read more about the problems that the non-native researchers face and the solutions Vlasta and I propose. If you have some questions, feel free to post them in the comments below, or you can contact me at the email address that is also in the video description. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye!